Just after finishing the new stove, Trieu Duong suddenly heard a faint buzzing sound inside the house. When he looked around, he realized mosquitoes were already flying everywhere. His heart filled with worry as he glanced at little Truc Lam. Her skin was so delicate, and even a few bites could make her uncomfortable or sick. Without hesitation, Trieu Duong made an important decision. Tomorrow morning, he would take her to the market to find a mosquito net so she could sleep safely through the night. But will he be able to find the right one in time to protect his little girl? If you enjoy warm and heartfelt stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey with Trieu Duong and Truc Lam. The soft warmth from the newly finished stove still lingered inside the small house as the afternoon slowly settled over the valley. Sunlight slipped gently through the doorway, lighting the wooden floor in the quiet space where Trieu Duong and little Truc Lam had just finished celebrating their small victory of the day. Building the new stove had taken hours of careful work, cutting wood, arranging stones, adjusting every small detail so the fire could burn safely and steadily. For Trieu Duong, it wasn't just a stove. It was something he had built with his own hands to make life easier for his daughter. A warmer place to cook, a safer way to prepare food, and one more improvement to the home where Truc Lam was growing up. Now that the work was finished, the atmosphere inside the house felt calm and peaceful. Trieu Duong sat down beside the stove, still catching his breath from the long day. His clothes carried the smell of wood and smoke, and his hands were rough from working, but his expression was gentle as he turned his attention back to the person who mattered most. Little Truc Lam was sitting nearby, quietly watching him with bright, curious eyes. She didn't understand the work that had just been done, but she could feel the happiness in the air. Whenever her father looked at her, she responded with the calm trust only a child can give. Trieu Duong smiled and moved closer to her. "Are you hungry again, little one?" he murmured softly. He carefully prepared a simple meal and made sure everything was warm and safe before feeding her. Every movement was slow and patient. He supported her gently, wiped her mouth when needed, and waited each time she paused. Feeding Truc Lam was never something he rushed through. For him, these moments were as important as any work he did outside. After she finished eating, he lifted her upright against his shoulder and gently patted her back to help her burp. The motion had become a natural rhythm for him now. Tap, pause, tap, pause. Truc Lam rested quietly against his shoulder, completely comfortable in her father's arms. When she finally gave a tiny burp, Trieu Duong chuckled softly. "There we go. Good girl." He lowered her carefully and sat beside her while finishing his own meal. It wasn't anything fancy, just something simple to fill his stomach after the day's labor. But sharing the quiet moment with his daughter made it feel satisfying. Outside, the afternoon breeze moved softly through the trees. The sound of birds faded slowly as the day began shifting toward evening. Inside the house, everything felt peaceful. But then Trieu Duong heard it, a faint buzzing sound. At first it was so quiet he almost ignored it. But a moment later the sound came again, slightly closer this time. He lifted his head and glanced toward the corner of the room. A mosquito floated, lazily in the air, then another, and another. Within seconds, he noticed several small dark shapes drifting slowly through the house, moving toward the warmer parts of the room. Trieu Duong's expression changed immediately. The relaxed smile disappeared, replaced by a serious look of concern. Mosquitoes. In a place surrounded by nature, they were always around. But inside the house, near his baby daughter, they were a problem he could not ignore. His eyes quickly shifted toward Truc Lam. She was sitting peacefully, completely unaware of the tiny insects beginning to circle nearby. Trieu Duong stood up right away. Without making any sudden movements that might startle her, he gently waved his hand through the air around her to drive the insects away. "Hey, not here," he muttered quietly. The mosquitoes scattered slightly, but only for a moment. A few seconds later, they drifted back again. Trieu Duong frowned. He crouched beside Truc Lam and carefully checked her arms and cheeks. Her skin was soft and smooth. No bites yet. That brought him a small sense of relief, but the worry in his chest didn't disappear. Mosquito bites were more than just annoying. They could cause itching, swelling, and sometimes sickness. The thought of Truc Lam being uncomfortable, or worse, becoming ill, made his heart tighten. He quickly grabbed a small cloth and began waving it gently around the room. The mosquitoes scattered again, moving toward the doorway. For a moment, the air seemed clear, but only a moment. Soon the buzzing sound returned. More mosquitoes drifted inside, drawn by the cool shade of the house. Trieu Duong let out a quiet sigh. This isn't good. He moved carefully around the room, chasing them away from the sleeping area, the bedding, and especially from the space where Truc Lam was playing. Every few seconds, he returned to her side, waving the cloth gently around her face and hands. Truc Lam watched him with wide, curious eyes. To her, it probably looked like her father was playing some strange game, waving the cloth through the air again and again. But Trieu Duong wasn't playing. His mind was already racing. If there were this many mosquitoes in the afternoon, there would be even more at night. Nighttime was when they became most active, and nighttime was when Truc Lam needed peaceful sleep. He glanced toward the small sleeping area inside the house. Right now, there was nothing protecting it, nothing to stop mosquitoes from flying directly to her while she slept. That thought made him stop moving for a moment. He imagined Truc Lam lying there in the dark while mosquitoes buzzed around her. He imagined her waking up crying from itchy bites, or worse, becoming sick. Trieu Duong tightened his grip on the cloth. No, that can't happen. He immediately returned to Truc Lam and lifted her into his arms. She leaned comfortably against him, unaware of the quiet battle her father had just been fighting. Trieu Duong gently brushed a hand over her hair, while continuing to wave the cloth around them. For several minutes, he kept driving the insects away, trying to clear the room as much as possible. But deep down, he knew something. This was only a temporary solution. The mosquitoes would come back again tonight, and again tomorrow, unless he did something about it. Trieu Duong stood still for a moment, thinking carefully. Then the idea came to him. The market. If he went early tomorrow morning, he might be able to find a mosquito net, a simple protective net that could cover Truc Lam's sleeping area. Something light, breathable, and strong, enough to keep the insects away. He looked down at his daughter again. She blinked up at him, calm and trusting. At that moment, the decision became clear. Tomorrow morning, he would take Truc Lam to the market. He would find a mosquito net for her. No matter how simple their life was, some things were too important to delay. A baby needed peaceful sleep. A baby needed protection, and Trieu Duong was determined to provide both. He gently kissed the top of her head and whispered softly, "Tomorrow we'll go get something to keep you safe, little one." Outside, the evening breeze continued to move, quietly through the trees. Inside the small house, Trieu Duong remained alert, still waving the cloth whenever another mosquito came near. The celebration of the new stove had already passed. Now his attention had shifted to something even more important. protecting Truc Lam's sleep, protecting her health, and making sure that when night came, his little daughter would be safe from the buzzing insects that had begun filling their home. For Trieu Duong, being a father meant exactly this: noticing the small dangers, acting before they became real problems, and always putting Truc Lam's comfort and safety above everything else. Tomorrow morning, father and daughter would head to the market together, and he would not return until he found the mosquito net that would finally allow Truc Lam to sleep peacefully through the night. Even after making that decision, Trieu Duong did not relax for the rest of the afternoon. The celebration over the new stove had faded into the background, replaced by the quiet, constant alertness of a father who had noticed a threat near his child. He kept Truc Lam close, rarely letting more than a few seconds pass without looking at her face, her hands, or the air around her. The house still held the gentle warmth from the fire, and the light outside was slowly turning softer as the day moved toward evening. Normally, this would have been one of the calmest parts of the day. After hard work, after feeding Truc Lam, after finishing something important for the home, Trieu Duong might have allowed himself a small moment of rest. But not now. Each faint buzzing sound sharpened his attention immediately. He lifted Truc Lam into his arms again and carried her to the cleanest part of the room, away from the doorway where the mosquitoes seemed to drift in most easily. She settled against him without protest, relaxed and trusting, her small fingers gently touching the front of his shirt. Trieu Duong lowered his head and looked at her carefully. Her cheeks were still smooth. Her tiny arms showed no red marks. Seeing that gave him some relief, but only for a moment. He picked up a cloth and began waving it slowly through the air around her. The motion was steady and patient, never hurried enough to frighten her. When a mosquito came too close, he drove it away at once. Then he checked her again. Then he scanned the room. Then he returned his eyes to her. It became a quiet cycle of protection, repeated over and over, as naturally as breathing. Truc Lam watched him with wide, curious eyes. She could not understand what was happening, of course. To her, her father was simply moving around her again and again, always close, always gentle. But that was how Trieu Duong wanted it. He wanted her to feel only comfort, not tension. He would carry the worry himself. For a while, he walked slowly around the room with her in his arms, trying to clear the space as much as he could. He passed by the bedding, checking carefully where she would sleep later. He glanced into the corners of the room, near the stove, near the wall, near the small areas where shadows had begun to gather as the afternoon light weakened. Every place mosquitoes might settle, he checked. Every place they might come from, he noticed. Once or twice, he managed to push several mosquitoes back out through the doorway, and for a brief moment the room seemed calmer, but it never lasted. Soon the faint buzzing returned, drifting in from somewhere outside or from some hidden corner he had missed. That was when Trieu Duong understood fully that this was not a problem he could solve with only a cloth and a careful hand. He could protect Truc Lam for tonight by staying close. But that was only temporary. What she needed was something real, something dependable. He looked once more at her sleeping area and imagined the night ahead. If he laid her down there without any protection, mosquitoes could circle above her all night. They could land on her face, her little hands, her soft legs. She might wake up crying, rubbing at itchy bites without understanding why she was uncomfortable. Worse than that, the bites could make her sick. That thought stayed in his chest like a weight. Trieu Duong sat down carefully with Truc Lam still in his arms and pressed her gently against his shoulder. She made a small happy sound and relaxed there, completely at ease. He rubbed her back slowly, his eyes never leaving the room for long. He knew he had already decided what to do in the morning, but now the plan felt even more urgent. This was no longer just a useful purchase, it was necessary. Tomorrow he would take her to the market and buy a mosquito net. He did not speak the thought aloud at first. He simply held her and let the plan settle firmly in his mind. He pictured leaving early, before the day became too warm. He pictured carrying her carefully, keeping her shaded and comfortable on the way. He pictured walking through the market stalls until he found a net fine enough to keep mosquitoes out and light enough for her to sleep peacefully beneath it. The image gave him direction, and once Trieu Duong had direction, he rarely hesitated. As evening drew closer, he focused on keeping Truc Lam comfortable. He prepared her for the night with the same patient routine that always centered on her needs first. He checked her clothes, adjusted them so she would neither feel too warm nor too cold, and made sure she was calm before feeding her again. Even during feeding, his eyes kept lifting toward the air around them. Whenever he heard buzzing too near, he paused just long enough to wave the cloth and drive the insect away before returning his full attention to her. Everything he did flowed together naturally, feeding her, shielding her, watching her, comforting her. After she finished, he lifted her gently and rested her upright against his shoulder, patting her back in slow, familiar rhythms until she gave a tiny burp. A faint smile crossed his face. "That's my good girl," he murmured softly. He stayed that way for a long moment, her small body warm against his chest, his chin lightly near the top of her head. Outside, the sounds of the evening were growing clearer. Inside, the room was dimmer now, and the mosquitoes seemed bolder in the deepening shadows. Trieu Duong's expression changed again, becoming more serious. Night would be the hardest part. Instead of laying Truc Lam down right away, he sat beside the bedding and kept her in his arms a little longer. With one hand, he continued fanning the air around her. With the other, he supported her carefully as she grew more sleepy. The movement of the cloth became almost rhythmic. Sweep the air, pause, check her face, listen, sweep again. It was not the kind of protection he wanted for her, but it was the best he could do for now. When her eyelids finally became heavy and her breathing softened, Trieu Duong laid her down very carefully. He adjusted her position, smoothed the bedding, and stayed beside her immediately. He did not move away. He kept the cloth in hand and continued guarding her sleep, watching for every mosquito that drifted too near. A few times he leaned in just to check her skin again, making sure no bites had appeared. A few times he swatted the air near the bedding before the insects could settle. Sleep came late to him that night, and even then it was light and broken. Every small sound pulled him awake. Every faint buzz made him sit up. Yet there was no frustration in him, only determination. This was simply what being Truc Lam's father meant. If she needed protection, he would stay awake. If she needed comfort, he would give it. If a problem appeared, he would solve it. So by the time the first pale light of morning touched the house, Trieu Duong was already awake and already thinking of the market. He looked first at Truc Lam. She was still sleeping peacefully, and that sight filled him with relief. But it also deepened his resolve. He did not want another evening like the last one. He did not want to spend another night battling mosquitoes one by one while she slept. Today he would change that. As soon as she stirred awake, his whole attention returned softly to her. He cleaned her up, changed her clothes, and made sure she was comfortable for the trip ahead. He fed her carefully so she would be Content on the road. He checked everything twice, the way only a deeply attentive parent would. Then when she was ready, he lifted her into his arms and held her close. The road to the market was waiting, and in Trieu Duong's heart, the purpose of that journey was completely clear. He was not going there for himself. He was going to bring back peace for Truc Lam's sleep, protection for her small, fragile body, and one more quiet layer of care in the life he was building for her day by day. After finishing a new stove for their small home, Trieu Duong enjoys a quiet afternoon with his baby daughter Truc Lam. But the peaceful moment quickly changes when he hears a faint buzzing sound. Looking around the house, he realizes that mosquitoes are already flying inside. Worried that the insects might bite Truc Lam and make her uncomfortable or even sick, Trieu Duong immediately begins chasing them away. He carefully checks her skin, keeps her close, and protects her as best as he can throughout the evening. As night approaches, he understands that simply driving the mosquitoes away will not be enough. Wanting his daughter to sleep safely and peacefully, he makes an important decision. Early the next morning, Trieu Duong plans to take Truc Lam to the market to buy a mosquito net. With love and determination, he hopes to find a simple solution that will protect his little girl through the night.